one thing people always ask when it comes to autism is what is it? What is autism? You know, how would you define it? How would you describe it? And so on and so forth. And it's actually a really tricky question because so much of it is still very tightly embedded in the medical literature and in, you know, the kind of the diagnostic criteria and things like that, that it can be difficult to give a decent idea of what autism is without falling down a rabbit hole of deficiencies and you know, things that we things that we just can't do, and a load of, you know, tremendously negative and pathologized kind of stuff. So I'm going to try now to break autism down into a couple of different chunks about, you know, that kind of sum up a little bit from my point of view, at least, what autism consists of. And I've managed to break it down into four discrete pieces, okay, and they do interact to an extent, but equally, you know, they can be spoken of quite separately as well, in the aim that, you know, you will get a better understanding of what autism actually is and what it's like to be autistic, and therefore, you know, what can maybe be done to help autistic people you know, thrive and enjoy a better quality of life generally. So the four things that I've broken it down into are communication, okay, that's a big thing. Sensory sensitivity, okay, what we call monotropism, and finally executive dysfunction. Okay, so they're my four kind of breakdown chunks of what autism is. There are other bits to it, I suppose, you know, and different people have different ways of kind of categorizing it and so on and so forth. But that's how I tend to break it down into these kind of four fairly easy to remember bits. So we'll start with communication. Okay, so obviously the ability to communicate between human beings in order to share ideas, etc., etc. Okay, you know, the communication. So obviously it's quite an important part of being a person, being human. You know, it's one of the things that makes us this kind of, you know, force to be reckoned with as a species. But obviously there are significant differences in how autistic people communicate compared to how non-autistic people seem to communicate. And it seems increasingly obvious to me that that autistic people, if put together for whatever reason, actually don't appear to have anything like the same kind of problems with communication that an autistic person and a non-autistic person would have. You know, if you get autistic people together, they seem to be on a similar wavelength most of the time, you know, from what I can tell. Just like if you get no neurotypical people together, non-autistic people, they're kind of okay too. You know, they are able to communicate effectively without too many problems. The issues come when you try to cross those two neurotypes together, when you try and get autistic people and non-autistic people to communicate. And there's all kinds of different analogies and metaphors for this that do the rounds. I often use one that's quite familiar to most of us, I think, of trying to get like an Apple product, you know, a Mac or a iPhone or something like that, to communicate effectively with a Microsoft product. Okay, they're both very similar in terms of what they do. They're both electronic devices, and you can get them to communicate. You can get them to, you know, transmit data or whatever you want to call it. But there's a layer of difficulty that comes from the fact that they're not strictly on the same wavelength. They haven't been designed in the same way. They're not built the same way. Their architectures are slightly different, and that causes a bit of a barrier, a bit of a problem in translation between the two. Okay, and I do feel that autistic people and non-autistic people have a very, very similar experience there when that communication is attempted. So some of the ways that the kind of different means or different ways of communication that autistic people have compared to non-autistic people. Well, one example would be the reliance on implication, on inference. Okay, on giving clues, dropping clues and hinting at what you want to happen. I don't want to make sweeping generalizations, but it seems to me, generally speaking, that a lot of neurotypical people are pretty comfortable with doing that, with that way of communicating, with hinting at stuff and hoping that, you know, the other person picks up on the hint and then they do what you want them to do. You know, so for example, you know, you sit down, you say, oh, you know, I haven't had a drink for ages, in the hope that somebody near you will offer you a cup of tea or a coffee or I don't know, some delicious ice cold lemonade or something like that. You know, there's a hope there that that will happen. And 9 times out of 10, if you're talking to other neurotypical people, then yeah, that probably will happen because the implication tends to work. It seems to somehow be okay. You know, everyone's on the same page. You know, most neurotypical people appear to be okay and comfortable with this idea of communicating in that way. The problem comes when an autistic person wanders into the room, you know, and they hear the same thing, or haven't had a drink for ages, and they say something along the lines of, really? I had one just now. Or even, well, that's interesting. Well, I'm about to have one, but okay. You know, there's no malice. There's no selfishness necessarily. There's just not a picking up of that subtext. It's taking the words at their face value, which is just that this person is making a statement about the fact that they don't, you know, that they haven't had a drink for a while. You know, do with that what you will. Obviously, this isn't to say that autistic people don't figure this out in the end. You know, I mean, I've learned through long, painful experience that you can't keep doing that. If you're around neurotypical people, you do have to learn to, or at least try to learn, that a lot of the communication is implicit, and therefore do your best to kind of deal with that and fit in somehow. It's never easy. I've never learned to do it properly, but I do try. So, you know, autistic people can figure it out, but I don't think it ever becomes natural. And I think we're always going to be probably a bit prone to overthinking it and getting it wrong and misreading it when it's not there and missing it when it is there, all these different pitfalls. Okay, so that's one example, just one way that the type of communication, the way that we communicate is different between autistic and non-autistic people. The stereotype is that autistic people are very blunt, you know, almost cruel in their clarity and how simply they state things. I think the stereotype of it being cruel is quite cruel in itself, really. You know, obviously some autistic people will set out to ruin your day. I mean, we're only human. But I think for the most part, autistic people have got no desire to insult or to be rude or anything like that. It's just we have a much more straightforward, straight down the line kind of, you know, communicative style. In some ways, it's like a more exaggerated version of the difference between American English users and British English users. I've often thought this, that you know, it seems stereotypically generally that American English, you know, people who use American English are a bit more prone to be fairly straightforward and fairly clear, a little bit less dependent on implication perhaps, whereas, you know, famously British people love our implication. We love to hint at things because there's this kind of blockage of not wanting to ever ask for anything directly because it's, you know, it's kind of seen as rude or not okay in the culture. I don't know how much truth there is in any of that, but it's an interesting, you know, comparison to make. The relationship between autistic people and non-autistic people isn't far removed from that fairly well-known difference between the two transatlantic English-speaking cultures, and that's before we even bring Canada into it. I don't want to go there. So there we are. That's an example of the kind of communicative problem and difficulty that we can have. It's not a deficit. You know, in this case, it really isn't a deficit at all. It's a pure difference. It is purely different. I mean, I will say a little bit later on that executive dysfunction, I'm more willing to accept that that's something of a deficit because it causes me such massive problems. But the communication thing is, as I say, a purely difference-based thing. So it's obviously the case that we just need to get a little bit better as a society, and I think neurotypical people need to lead this a little bit, of trying to translate, you know, between the two of us, because we do our bit, you know, we try our best. Like I said earlier, we autistic people, generally speaking, try to learn the language of implication and try to use it for our own good, really. But it's just too difficult to figure out. You know, it's too complicated and weirdly sensitive and a tricky thing to deal with. So we could do with a kind of compromise of non-autistic people really, you know, reaching out and meeting us halfway, if not even a bit further on. Okay, so that's communication. There is more to it than that, but as a starting point, that I think is going to be okay. Next, then, we're going to talk about sensory sensitivity. Okay, so obviously we have lots of senses as human beings, but we will focus on the basic 5 that we learn in primary school. You know, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. Okay, it's fairly safe to say, I think, that the vast majority of autistic people have an interesting relationship with their senses and how they take in the data from the world through them. A lot of the time, we are inordinately sensitive to these senses. So, for example, lights can be brighter, sounds can be noisier and more insistent, smells can be more unpleasant and nauseating, tastes can be stronger and more difficult to handle, and sensation, being touched or heat or being, being rained on, being damp or something, can feel an awful lot more uncomfortable than a neurotypical person might expect. But interestingly, it can work both ways. You get often autistic people reporting that there's a kind of hyposensitivity, like not really feeling the sensations at all. So for example, autistic people who end up sort of ignoring sounds and not even really hearing them, or missing strong smells, or needing really quite firm contact for touch to register. And the interesting thing is that it really does vary from person to person, and it varies from time to time as well. So you might get an autistic person who 1 minute, like myself, is, like this because there is a car outside just kind of chugging its engine, just the engine's on, but no one's going anywhere. It's just making that horribly insistent noise, that kind of thing. You can't block it out. You can't ignore it. It's there. So 1 minute, you're completely stressed out about that. The next minute, you completely ignore a fire alarm going off or something ridiculous like that because it hasn't registered. And it might be, it's almost certainly going to be down to stress levels, incipient stress levels. So the higher the stress level is for, an autistic person, the more likely I think it is that the sensory sensitivity can become more of a problem. And likewise, if you're not so stressed, then it might go down. But even that isn't the full story. There are plenty of people who, as a stress response, will actually experience that hyposensitivity instead. It's impossible to generalize, especially this aspect of autism. You need to get to know the person, and figure out what their experience of this is. But let's just talk a little bit about an example of this hypersensitivity. So when the sensitivity is high and everything's a bit much. So, for example, when I was a teacher, I used to obviously have a classroom. And it was kind of fashionable at the time, this was in the early 2010s, to have a very busy classroom in terms of posters and displayed work and things like that. It was seen as being quite important that, if a head teacher or somebody walked into your classroom, that your classroom would be decorated, tremendously lavishly, almost like like Napoleon's boudoir, but with year 7's creative writing on the wall rather than, I don't know, paintings of fruit and nude people. It was seen as being tremendously important that there was all this kind of stuff everywhere, even to the point where I had things dangling from the ceiling. I'm very tall. I was walking into this stuff all the time, but it was seen as being so vital that I didn't really feel that I could argue with it. So I would just be walking around the classroom being hit in the face by, connectives dangling like a mobile above a baby's crib. It was looking back, it was kind of ridiculous, but it was seen as the norm. And I would say that for a lot of autistic people, that kind of environment is an absolute nightmare. It's just too much. There's too much colour, too many shapes, too much variation in hue, and all sorts of things, all trying to cram into the eyes, all trying to squeeze in as much as they can. Because in my experience, if there is stimuli around, then an autistic brain just wants it all. It just wants all of it. It's got no filter at all. It's got no interest in saying, no, actually, leave that. I'm not bothered by that. Leave that alone. I'm going to focus on this thing over here. It's just like that, all in at once. So, for example, if I'm in a doctor's surgery or a classroom or wherever, and there's writing on the walls, on posters and, displays and things like that, I will have to read it all. It will all go in. It will all be absorbed by my brain against my will, to be honest, because it's quite stressful to have all that information cramming itself into your brain. So you know, a typical classroom back in those days, and I think some are still like it today, is really quite hellish for a lot of autistic people, because it just becomes this source of tremendous, endless input. Now, obviously, in here, I'm surrounded by lots of colourful things, but crucially, they're all of a likeness. They're all the same thing. You know, this is all plastic bricks. You know, all of this is the same medium, and there's very little writing involved as well, of course. So, you know, though I appear to be surrounded by tremendously colourful, detailed things, there is, I think, a level of straightforwardness to it that makes it more manageable. That, and of course, that as it's a special interest of mine, I've got a kind of vested interest in it anyway, so I'm less likely to be bothered by it. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. So sensory sensitivity can really raise stress levels quite significantly. You know, that thing I mentioned earlier about the car engine just running and running and running. I can literally feel my stress levels increasing while that happens. I can feel my patience dropping, my temper building, and even physical sensations that come along with that. You know, like it might even, you know, weirdly enough, it might even give me a bellyache, a tummy ache. Just from the discomfort of hearing that constant sound. So it's no surprise to learn that, you know, if you've got like an autistic child, you know, like I was once upon a time, in a classroom where this is a problem, you know, where they're assailed by everything, that, you know, they're gonna find it difficult to concentrate. You know, they're gonna find it difficult to focus, and if they get told off by the teacher for not being able to focus, then they're more likely to snap. You know, respond angrily and with irritation, and obviously that will never go down particularly well, you know, especially with some teachers, that there will be a sense of, you know, well, that's not okay, I'm in charge here, how dare you. But you know, my take on that is, you know, as far as the kid's concerned, well, fair enough, you know, fair enough. If you had any idea what it's like to have this sense of everything crashing into your brain at once, then you would understand why, when a teacher says, why aren't you doing your writing? And you responded with, or leave me alone, or just walking out and slamming the door, you might actually understand where they're coming from a little bit. And maybe even empathise just a bit, you know, just a little. Because it is hard. It's very, very difficult to handle. It can have positive elements. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of autistic people are creative, artistic. You know, you get fantastic autistic illustrators, painters, musicians, all this kind of thing. And I'm absolutely certain that the sensory sensitivity has a part to play in that. Because if you are so finely tuned that everything goes in, then if you find a way to manage that and a way to make the best of that, then it's easy to see that you could turn that into something beautiful. You know, just by the sheer weight of everything that's going in, you know, the information influx. I'm sure, you know, it's possible to turn that around and make it into something amazing, you know, whether it's a drawing, a painting, a piece of music, whatever. So there are positives to it, but I have to say, you know, it can be pretty stressful, generally speaking. So that's sensory sensitivity. And don't forget, as I said, it can work the other way around, where there's a kind of real lack of that sensitivity, and almost like, you know, somebody like touches you and you don't even notice. So it's worthwhile bearing that in mind. Anyway, moving on to the third one. So this is monotropism. Okay, now this is a slightly more up-to-date idea behind autism generally. Is something that a lot of autistic people are getting increasingly invested in, because it seems to be as close as we have to a kind of grand unified theory of autism, because it does explain a lot. And it is primarily based upon this idea that again, autistic brains are different to non-autistic brains. And the concept being that non-autistic brains, like perhaps yours, are polytropic. Okay, meaning that you can take in and you can take in and understand and handle information and data and stimulus from a variety of separate places all at once, you know, and be able to handle it, you know, and that be natural for you, you know, that being your normal way of being. Whereas autistic people appear to be what we call monotropic, which is where we prefer to have our attention entirely fixated and focused on one thing at a time. Okay, almost to a fault. You know, just one thing at a time, moving through nice and logically. And it explains an awful lot of things. You know, first of all, it explains it goes some way to explain the sensory sensitivity, because, you know, if you put all of your brain's attention onto one thing, even if that one thing is like your surroundings, and you let that happen, then obviously you're going to be bombarded by everything in that situation. You know, it almost like strengthens the solution, almost, you know, like there's no dilution. Although it does also seem to contradict in some ways, because, as I said, it can feel like you're taking in everything from everywhere, and that doesn't quite fit with monotropism, unless you consider monotropism to include being fixated just on the actual act of taking in information, if that makes sense. You know, having that as a thing, and being the thing that we're focused on is just taking in information, then it helps to, you know, it actually does link in quite nicely. But anyway, the point is that monotropism is really good at explaining some of the other aspects of autism. So, for example, we've got the special interests. Obviously, that's something that I'm very keen on. You know, I've written a whole book on that, because this idea that we as autistic people have things that go beyond hobbies, the interests that go way beyond the normal kind of focus that a neurotypical person might have. Because we have such a kind of passion and fondness for them that they become all-consuming, and also sources of tremendous calm and respite, you know, from the kind of stress of the world. So, for example, you know, my special interest, Lego. If I allow myself to, I can become completely immersed in the world of Lego, whether it's reading about it or designing stuff or building or whatever it might be, or even playing with it, you know, spaceships going boo. Then you become so immersed in it that it becomes all you're really focused on, the only thing. And everything else in the world is lost and kind of, you know, ignored for a time. So, you know, your focus is so hyper fixated on that one thing, like a laser, that anything else happening around you might be missed or ignored completely. Okay, so a good example of that would be, you know, if I'm indulging in one of my special interests, whatever it might be, you know, building a Lego set, for example, a big one, then, you know, the likelihood of me becoming so immersed in it that I forget to eat, or forget to drink, or forget to go to the loo, or forget to do pretty much anything, really, is very, very high. You know, I'm very likely for that to happen. You know, that I will just forget to do basic things, because my attention is completely fixated on that one thing, this one thing of building the model. And actually, that's when I might become quite hyposensitive to the things happening around me. You know, I might become kind of numbed to the to any sounds that would otherwise bother me, or to any bright lights that would otherwise irritate me, or to any physical discomfort that would otherwise cause me pain or unhappiness. You know, I might actually be so fixated on what I'm doing that, you know, those things drop away as well. So you can see how these things all kind of link together a little bit. So yeah, when we're talking about this monotropic kind of single-mindedness, it's important to bear that in mind, and how it affects our ability to move from thing to thing. We talk about autistic inertia, which is the name that seems to have been attached. It's quite a good name, I think, to the phenomenon whereby when we're doing one thing, it becomes quite a slow process to go from that one thing to the next thing. So, for example, if I am, you know, feverishly building a Lego model, and then it's time to make dinner, it's very difficult for me to switch between those two modes, those two focal points. Okay, so whereas one person might be able to just be like, right, put that away, stand up, go and do it, you know, without any real hassle. I mean, neither thing is difficult. They're both something that have been done many times before. They might just be able to just, you know, switch straight away, happily. I, on the other hand, will find that transition very, very difficult. It will be very slow for a start. It will be slow moving, but also it will be met with tremendous resistance within my head somewhere, like a desperate kind of grinding of gears. You know, almost like my brain is screaming, "No, you know, stop trying to go from this to this." And you know, my brain will say things that I'm not okay with, if you like. They'll say you don't need to cook dinner. Don't be silly. You don't need to cook dinner. You just don't do it. Just don't do it. Just carry on with this. Carry on with this. And that can be quite difficult to deal with. If you've got that happening all the time, every single time you ever want to go from doing one thing to doing another, then that can get quite tiresome and quite exhausting. So this in autistic inertia is quite a potent force, and it means that autistic people, generally speaking, can really benefit from being given a kind of heads up, like a 5-minute warning when something's about to change, or can really benefit from reminding themselves, even if it's like a little phone reminder on their calendar. By the way, it's 10 to 5. You might want to start thinking about switching to dinner mode now. In my latest book, I compared it to how motorway signage works. Motorway signage would be great for autistic inertia because it gives you so many warnings when a junction's coming up. When you've got a decision to make and when you've got to change route on the motorway, it's great. It's just like autistic people would like. You give them plenty of warning, plenty of time to figure out what you need to do and what lane you need to be in. You're given that kind of countdown, and then when you get to the off road, the off ramp or the slipway or whatever you want to call it, it's nice and gentle and kind of it loops round very, very grandly. There's no sharp 90-degree corners because, of course, at that speed, that would be a death trap. So it's actually quite a nice analogy. That is something that I think a lot of autistic people would like if they could somehow translate that into how to plan their day. That would actually be really quite useful. That'd be quite nice. So yeah, monotropism. Special interests, autistic inertia, big part of what it is to be autistic. Okay, and finally we have got executive dysfunction. Okay, so executive function, the positive form, is something that all human beings have. It's part of our brain function. It's the part of our brain. I can't never remember which part of the brain it is. It doesn't really matter. I'm not a biologist. It's the part of the brain that is in control of decision making, prioritizing, planning. That kind of higher order thinking, the kind of thing that again separates us somewhat from the cat. So it's quite an important part of the brain. It's quite an important set of functions that it's in control of. And it seems that autistic people have a little bit of an issue there somewhere. Like it just doesn't seem to work quite properly. And this is the thing that I'm most likely to, label as anything approaching a deficit. I don't like the word deficit. I'm not really going to use it again after this. But, I find executive dysfunction to be a tremendous burden. I find it very difficult to deal with and to live with. And I know that it's also quite a feature of ADHD as well, which is something that I'm in the process of being diagnosed for anyway. Seems like things are up in the air at the moment about whether it's more an autistic thing or more an ADHD thing, or is it just a bit of both, or is it just, kind of commonality between the two? Whatever's the case, you're going to find a lot of autistic people have this issue with executive dysfunction. So what we're looking at here is going to be, on a straightforward level, it's going to be forgetfulness, and this is definitely an ADHD thing as well. So it's a level of forgetfulness that is almost comical in its extremity, and it's something that has caused me personally years and years worth of trauma and problems, because it's the kind of forgetfulness where you might find yourself thinking, right, I'm now going to send that really important email. Okay, got a really important email to send. I don't know, to something that's a big deal, like a bank or the tax man or something. I'm going to do that now. I'm going to sit down and do that. Sit down at the computer. Okay, you open your emails. You start, you start putting one together. You don't really write much yet, but then something happens, like something pops up, or the phone rings, or you go and get a glass of water or something like that. And in the process of that interruption occurring, you completely forget, totally forget that you were ever writing that important email. It's just gone. Okay? Now, you might be sitting there neurotypical and yet absent-minded and thinking to yourself, yeah, I get that. My mind's like a sieve as well. And fair enough, I'm sure this is not limited to autistic people, but it's the amount of times a day that it causes the problem, I think, is quite, specific to neurodivergent people. Because, of course, it means that, that email then doesn't get sent. And whenever this has happened to me, and it happens to me on a literally daily basis, you know, in one way or another, it might be months before I remember that I never actually sent that email. Months. It might be when, you know, a bill reminder appears and I'm like, oh my God, I didn't do that thing. You know, that really important thing. And honestly, the things can be so important. You know, it can be such vitally important things that you still just forget, like it was never there in the first place. And the thing that stands out for me is how total the forgetting is, how sudden it is as well. It's almost like, you know, just wiping it off a blackboard, just whoosh, gone. And it can cause, you know, significant problems. And a lot of people, tongue in cheek, but I kind of like it, have described the financial impact of this as being like the autism tax, or the neurodivergence tax, or the ADHD tax, which I think is kind of similar to, you know, people talk about, you know, like the woman tax, you know, for the fact that, you know, women don't get reimbursed anything like the way that their male counterparts do for any given activity. You know, it's kind of, it's just a problem that just exists that really needs dealing with. But for autistic people or ADHD people, it's the fact that we lose so much money on a yearly basis through these brief moments of forgetting. You know, these times where we just don't do the thing that we really had to do. So some really good examples of this that happen very frequently, you know, forgetting to cancel that free membership that's about to turn into a paid membership, you know, the free trial thing, where all of a sudden, you know, it goes from being free to being, you know, £4,000 a month or whatever, something daft. You know, the amount of money I've personally lost on those kind of things is embarrassing, and I'm not going to talk about it any more than that because I really can't bear to. But it can go beyond that as well. You know, it can be fees for overdrafts, fees for late payment of bills, anything where there's money involved. Being tremendously forgetful and you know, not setting your priorities straight is going to cost you money, and it's going to cause problems. So yeah, executive dysfunction is exhausting. It's difficult to live with. It's difficult for people to live with you as well. You know, like if you live with other people, neurotypical or not, it can make you. It makes me feel tremendously unreliable. You know, because I will just forget things so easily and so quickly, which is a bad feeling. You know, you don't want to feel unreliable. You don't want to feel like you can't be trusted, but you know, I have to throw my hands in the air up and say, you know what, actually, you know, I really can't be trusted, because even if I write a list, even if I write something like a reminder, all that needs to happen is that from the moment of reading the reminder, send the email, and to actually doing it, if anything interrupts in that time period, it's gone anyway. So what's the point of the list in the first place? It doesn't stop me doing the lists. I mean, I still try, you know, you still give it a go. But it's amazing how difficult it is to combat, you know, and to try to alleviate as a problem. So there we go. A very whistle-stop tour there for communication, sensory sensitivity, monotropism, and executive dysfunction. Okay, 4 big parts of what it is to be autistic, to some degree ADHD as well. And of course, you know, from those 4 kind of starting points, it's possible to begin to explore, well, what can we do to improve life for autistic people based on these 4 things? You know, what can we do to do with communication? What can we do to do with sensory sensitivity, and so on and so forth? You know, once you know about these 4 areas, then making accommodation and making life more manageable for autistic people becomes much easier, because you have something to work with. Okay, so yeah, I'll talk about some of these things probably in more detail another time. My next video is going to be about autistic masking. That will be in the next week or so. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. If you did, then, you know, do that whole thing where you subscribe and you like it and all that sort of stuff, you know, like they say. And yeah, look forward to the next video, I suppose. Okay.